She woke up with her head on a stranger's shoulder, 30,000 feet in the air, and realized her life was about to change forever. But before we get to that moment, you need to understand what desperation really looks like when you're a single mother with $73 in your bank account and a child waiting at home who believes you can fix everything. What happened next wasn't just chance. It was the collision of two worlds that should never have touched a moment so raw and unexpected that it would unravel secrets, rewrite destinies, and prove that sometimes the universe conspires in ways that shatter every wall we build around our hearts. Stay with me. What comes next might heal your heart or reveal truths you've buried deep inside. Emma Richardson had forgotten what sleep felt like. Real sleep, the kind that doesn't jolt you awake every hour with anxiety clawing at your chest, reminding you of unpaid bills, overdue rent, and a 6-year-old daughter who deserves so much more than cold cereal for dinner 3 nights in a row. She sat in seat 23B on Flight 747 from Chicago to New York, her body pressed against the window, eyes burning from exhaustion that had become her constant companion. Her interview in Chicago had been a disaster. 3 hours of her life she'd never get back. 3 hours away from Lily. 3 hours spent convincing herself that maybe, just maybe, this marketing position would be the answer to their prayers. But the interviewer's eyes had told her everything before his mouth formed the words, "We'll be in touch." That phrase that really means don't hold your breath, don't wait by the phone, don't dream too big, because this world wasn't built for women like you women who show up with determination in their eyes and desperation in their resumes. The plane was half empty, a Tuesday afternoon flight that most people avoided. But Emma had chosen it because it was $30 cheaper than the morning option. $30. The difference between eating and not eating for 3 days. The mathematics of poverty that nobody talks about, the constant calculations that run through your mind like a ticker tape of shame and survival. She'd packed a granola bar in her purse, told herself it was lunch, ignored the hollow ache in her stomach that had become as familiar as breathing. The man in seat 23A hadn't looked at her when he sat down. Why would he? Emma knew what she looked like. Her blazer from Target, 5 years old and slightly frayed at the cuffs, her shoes that she'd polished that morning to hide the scuffs, her hair pulled back in a ponytail because she couldn't afford a haircut and the split ends were getting obvious. She was invisible, the way struggling mothers become invisible in a world that celebrates success and looks away from survival. He wore a suit that probably cost more than her rent, not flashy but the kind of expensive that whispers rather than shouts. Charcoal grey, perfectly tailored, the fabric moving with him like water. His watch was simple, elegant, the kind of timepiece that carries generations of craftsmanship in every tick. His hands, she noticed, were strong but gentle as he adjusted his seatbelt, and there was something in the way he moved that spoke of power held carefully in check. Authority worn so naturally it didn't need announcement. Emma didn't know his name, didn't know that Alexander Hunt was a name that made stock markets tremble and boardrooms fall silent, didn't know that the man sitting 18 inches away from her controlled an empire worth billions, that his decisions moved economies, that presidents and prime ministers took his calls at midnight. She just saw a stranger who seemed as tired as she felt, and somehow that made her feel less alone in her exhaustion. The plane began to taxi. Emma closed her eyes, pressed her forehead against the cool window, and felt the tears she'd been holding back all day finally break free. Silent tears, the kind you cry when you've learned that sobbing draws attention and attention brings judgment. She thought about Lily, her baby girl with Emma's green eyes and her father's smile, that father who'd walked away before Lily's first birthday, who'd decided that fatherhood looked better on paper than in practice. Lily was with Mrs. Chen next door, the elderly woman who watched her for $10 a day, a rate so low it made Emma's heart ache with gratitude and shame in equal measure. The engines roared, the plane lifted, and somewhere between the ground and the sky, somewhere between holding on and letting go, Emma Richardson fell asleep. Not the fitful half-sleep she was used to, but deep, complete, absolute surrender. Her body, exhausted beyond endurance, simply gave up the fight. Her head tilted, drifted, and came to rest on the shoulder of the stranger beside her. Alexander Hunt felt the weight of her head against his shoulder and froze. His first instinct was to shift away, to maintain the bubble of personal space that men of his position guarded religiously. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the way she'd been crying so quietly he'd pretended not to notice. Maybe it was the granola bar wrapper sticking out of her purse, the only food she'd brought for a full day of travel. Maybe it was the way her hands, even in sleep, clutched her phone like a lifeline and he'd glimpsed the screensaver. A little girl with missing front teeth and joy that seemed to light up the screen. Or maybe it was something deeper, something that whispered in the part of his soul he'd learned to ignore in boardrooms and negotiations. This woman was fighting a battle he'd never had to face, and in this moment, on this flight, the least he could do was let her rest. So Alexander Hunt, the man who'd built an empire on calculated risks and strategic moves, made a decision that had nothing to do with profit margins or market share. He sat perfectly still, adjusted his position slightly to make her more comfortable, and let a stranger sleep on his shoulder while the world passed by 30,000 feet below. He didn't know her name, didn't know her story, didn't know that this single act of unexpected kindness would become the first thread in a tapestry that would change both their lives forever. Because here's what nobody tells you about kindness. It's never really random. It's the universe's way of saying, pay attention. Something important is happening here, something that will matter more than you can possibly imagine. And in that moment, with Emma's soft breathing against his shoulder and the weight of her exhausted hope pressed against his expensive suit, destiny began to weave its intricate design. Emma slept for 2 hours and 17 minutes. Alexander knew because he checked his watch 3 times. Careful not to move too suddenly, protecting her rest the way you'd protect something precious and fragile. He'd missed 2 conference calls, ignored 14 emails, and declined the flight attendant's offer of champagne with a quiet shake of his head. The businesswoman across the aisle had stared at him twice, recognition flickering in her eyes, but he'd met her gaze with a look that said, don't, just don't, and she'd turned away. In his world, privacy was currency, and right now he was spending it on a stranger who needed sleep more than he needed to maintain his carefully constructed public image. He found himself studying her reflection in the window, the way exhaustion had carved shadows under her eyes, the slight frown that creased her forehead, even in sleep, as if worry had become so permanent it followed her into dreams. Her jacket had ridden up slightly, revealing a small hole in the elbow she'd tried to hide by folding her arms. Her nails were cut short, practical, unpolished. No wedding ring, just a thin line of paler skin where one used to be, the ghost of a promise that hadn't survived reality. Alexander understood ghosts. He'd built his empire by learning to read people, to see what they tried to hide, to understand the stories written in the details others overlooked. This woman was a fighter. You could see it in the set of her jaw, the way even in sleep she held herself with a kind of dignity that poverty couldn't erase. She reminded him of his mother, back before the money, back when they'd lived in that 1-bedroom apartment where cockroaches outnumbered hope, and his mother had worked 3 jobs to keep him in school. His mother who'd told him every single day that circumstances don't define you, that the size of your bank account has nothing to do with the size of your heart. His mother who died 6 months after his first billion, finally able to rest, but too worn out to enjoy it. He still carried that guilt, that awful knowledge that he'd succeeded too late to save her from the grinding wheel of poverty that had stolen her health one exhausted day at a time. The plane hit turbulence. Emma stirred, her hand instinctively reaching out and grasping his arm, fingers tightening with sudden fear. Alexander covered her hand with his, a gesture so natural he didn't think about it until he'd already done it. "You're safe," he murmured, words so quiet they were almost thought rather than spoken. She settled back into sleep, her grip loosening but not letting go entirely, and Alexander felt something shift in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years. Not attraction, though she was beautiful in that raw, unpolished way that no amount of money could manufacture. Not pity, because this woman didn't need pity. Something else. Recognition, maybe. The sense that life had just placed someone in his path for a reason he didn't yet understand, but needed to discover. When Emma finally woke, it happened in stages. First, the awareness of warmth, of comfort she hadn't felt in so long, she'd almost forgotten it existed. Then, the slow realization that she was leaning against something solid and breathing. Then, horror. Pure, absolute, mortifying horror. She jerked upright so fast her neck cracked, eyes flying open, hand going to her mouth. "Oh my God!" she gasped, her face flushing red from her chest to her hairline. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to. I don't know how I'm so incredibly sorry." Her words tumbled over each other, panic and embarrassment making her voice shake. She couldn't look at him, couldn't bear to see the disgust or annoyance she was certain would be written across his face. She'd invaded his space, drooled on his expensive suit. There was probably drool. Oh God, was there drool? Her hand flew to her mouth, checking, and yes, there it was, the slight wetness at the corner of her lips that confirmed her complete and utter humiliation. "Please," Alexander said, his voice carrying a warmth that made her finally brave enough to glance at him. "Don't apologize. You needed to sleep." He smiled, and it transformed his face from severe to something almost gentle. "I've been told I have very comfortable shoulders. Consider it a compliment." Emma stared at him, certain she'd misheard, certain this man in his clearly expensive suit and his aura of quiet power was being sarcastic. But his eyes, deep brown and unexpectedly kind, told her he meant it. "I drooled on you," she whispered, mortification making her voice small. "Probably," he agreed, and there was humor in his tone, the kind that invited her to laugh with him rather than at herself. "But I've survived worse in business meetings, so I think I'll recover." Despite herself, despite everything, Emma felt a small laugh escape. It felt foreign, that sound, like she'd forgotten how to make it. "I can't believe I did that," she said, shaking her head. "I never sleep on planes. I never sleep anywhere, really. My daughter, she's 6, and I haven't been sleeping well, and I had this interview in Chicago that went terribly. And I'm babbling. I'm so sorry. I don't even know why I'm telling you this." She pressed her hands against her burning cheeks, wishing she could disappear into the seat cushions. Alexander tilted his head slightly, studying her with an intensity that should have made her uncomfortable, but somehow didn't. "Your daughter," he said. "The little girl on your phone screen, she has your eyes." Emma's hand went automatically to her phone, protective, surprised he'd noticed. "Lily, her name is Lily. She's everything. She's why I was in Chicago, why I'm doing any of this. I just want to give her better than what I had, you know." She stopped abruptly, realizing she was oversharing with a complete stranger, violating every rule of airplane etiquette. But Alexander nodded as if he understood completely, as if she'd said something profound rather than something painfully obvious. "I do know," he said quietly. "My mother used to say the same thing. She worked herself to death trying to give me better. She succeeded, but I wish she'd lived long enough to see it matter." There was something in his voice, a crack in the polished veneer that made Emma's heart squeeze with unexpected empathy. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it, this stranger's loss somehow feeling personal in the intimacy of this shared moment. They sat in silence for a moment, two people from completely different worlds connected by the universal language of love and loss and the fierce determination to protect the people who matter most. The flight attendant appeared, her professional smile fixed in place. "Mr. Hunt, we'll be landing in 20 minutes. Your car will be waiting at the private terminal." Emma felt the words like a physical blow. Mr. Hunt, private terminal. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Alexander Hunt. She'd been sleeping on the shoulder of Alexander Hunt, the billionaire CEO whose face appeared in Forbes and Fortune, whose companies employed hundreds of thousands, whose wealth was so vast it was essentially abstract. And she'd drooled on him. She'd told him about her failed interview and her struggle to feed her daughter. She'd exposed every vulnerable piece of herself to a man who probably spent more on lunch than she made in a month. The shame that crashed over her was different now, sharper, because it wasn't just embarrassment anymore. It was the awful awareness of the canyon between their lives, the impossible distance between his world and hers. "Emma," Alexander said, and she realized she must have said her name at some point during her rambling, though she couldn't remember when. "Would you let me help you?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications she couldn't begin to process. "Help me?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "How?" He pulled a card from his pocket, simple, elegant, embossed with just a name and a number. "I'm looking for someone to head up a new initiative at Hunt Industries, community outreach, programs for single parents, education access, someone who understands what it's really like, not just the statistics, but the reality. Someone with heart and fight, and the kind of determination that shows up to interviews even when the odds are impossible." He held out the card, and Emma stared at it like it might bite her. "You don't know me," she said. "You don't know if I'm qualified, if I can do the job. This is charity, and I don't need—" "It's not charity," Alexander interrupted, his voice firm but not unkind. "It's opportunity. What you do with it is entirely up to you. But Emma, I've spent 20 years learning to recognize potential, and I see it in you. The question is, do you see it in yourself? Sharing these deeply human stories isn't easy, but if you feel the weight of these impossible moments, when strangers become something more, when kindness cracks open doors you thought were permanently closed, subscribe and join us on this journey. Your like can spread hope to someone who needs it today, and your comment might share a story that touches another soul, searching for proof that miracles still happen in ordinary moments. We're all just trying to survive, trying to do better, trying to believe that sometimes the universe conspires in our favor. Don't face it alone. This community is here waiting for you." Emma took the card with trembling fingers, the heavy cardstock feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds in her hand. Alexander Hunt, Chief Executive Officer, Hunt Industries, a phone number with a New York area code that probably connected directly to an assistant who screened out people exactly like her, people who didn't belong in that stratosphere of power and influence. The plane was descending now, her ears popping with the pressure change, and she felt like she was falling in more ways than one, tumbling through a reality that had shifted so dramatically in the span of a single flight that she couldn't find her footing. "I don't understand," she whispered, looking up from the card to meet his eyes. "Why me? You don't know anything about me except that I'm a mess who falls asleep on strangers and can't even land a basic marketing job." Her voice cracked on the last words, the defeat of the day finally catching up with her now that the shock was wearing off. Alexander leaned forward slightly, his expression serious, intent, like she was the only person in the world who mattered in this moment. "I know you're a mother who traveled to another city on a hope and a prayer because you want better for your child. I know you packed a single granola bar for an entire day because that's what your budget allowed. But you did it anyway because giving up isn't in your vocabulary. I know that even in your sleep, exhausted beyond measure, you hold yourself with dignity. I know that when you talk about your daughter, your whole face lights up like she's the sun and you're just grateful to orbit in her warmth." He paused, and Emma felt tears burning behind her eyes because nobody had seen her, really seen her, in so long that his words felt like oxygen after drowning. "I know that you remind me why I built this company in the first place before the board meetings and stock prices and quarterly reports made me forget that business is supposed to be about people, not just profit margins. So, no, Emma, I don't know your resume or your credentials, but I know your character, and that's worth more than any degree from any university could ever teach." The plane touched down with a slight bump, the wheels kissing the runway, and Emma felt like she was landing in a different life than the one she'd taken off from. The other passengers began gathering their belongings, the usual chaos of deplaning filling the cabin with noise and movement, but Emma sat frozen, the card still clutched in her hand, her mind racing through possibilities and impossibilities in equal measure. "What if I fail?" she asked, the question so quiet she wasn't sure he'd heard it over the commotion around them. But Alexander had heard. He always heard the important things, the questions people were afraid to ask out loud, because the answers might confirm their deepest fears. "Then you fail," he said simply, "and you get back up and try again. That's what my mother taught me. That's what you're teaching your daughter every single day just by showing up and fighting even when everything feels impossible. Failure isn't the opposite of success, Emma. It's part of the path to it. The only real failure is not trying at all." They stood, gathering their minimal belongings, Emma with her worn purse and Alexander with his leather briefcase that probably cost more than her car. The other passengers were staring now, recognition dawning on faces as they realized who'd been sitting in economy, mixing with regular people like some kind of democratic experiment. Emma heard the whispers starting, saw phones being raised to sneak photos, and felt the weight of his world pressing down on her. This was what his life looked like. Constant scrutiny, no privacy, every moment documented and dissected. How did anyone breathe in that kind of spotlight? Alexander seemed completely unfazed, moving through the aisle with practiced ease, but Emma noticed the way his jaw tightened slightly, the way his shoulders squared as if preparing for battle. This was his armor, she realized, this calm, controlled exterior that never let anyone see the real person underneath. They exited into the terminal, and immediately Alexander was surrounded. 3 people in sharp suits appeared, as if summoned by invisible signals tablets and phones at the ready, speaking in rapid-fire bursts about meetings and calls and decisions that needed to be made right now this minute, while Alexander was still technically in transit. Emma started to step back, to fade into the crowd and disappear back into her anonymous life, but Alexander's hand caught her elbow, gentle but firm. "Wait," he said, then turned to his team. "Give me 5 minutes. Redirect the car to the main terminal. I'll meet you at passenger pickup." The assistants exchanged glances, clearly surprised, but nobody argued. When Alexander Hunt gave an order, people followed it, no questions asked. That was the kind of power that came from building an empire from nothing, from proving yourself over and over until your word became law. He guided Emma away from the chaos, finding a quiet corner near a closed gift shop, a small pocket of peace in the perpetual motion of JFK Airport. "Call me tomorrow," he said, and it wasn't a suggestion. 9 a.m., that number goes directly to me, not an assistant. We'll set up a proper meeting, discuss the position, see if it's a fit. But Emma, I need you to promise me something. She nodded, not trusting her voice. Promise me you won't talk yourself out of this tonight. Promise me you won't spend the next 12 hours listing all the reasons you're not qualified or good enough or deserving. Because I've seen 1,000 qualified people who didn't have half your heart, and I'd rather build something meaningful with someone who cares than something profitable with someone who doesn't. His eyes held hers, intense and sincere, and Emma felt something shift inside her, some frozen part of her heart that had given up on hope, starting to thaw. "I promise," she whispered, and meant it, even though she could already feel the doubts gathering like storm clouds at the edges of her mind. Alexander smiled, that same transformation that made him look younger, more human, less like a photograph from a business magazine, and more like the man who'd let a stranger sleep on his shoulder for 2 hours without complaint. "Good. Now go get your daughter, tell her about the plane ride. Maybe leave out the drooling part if you want to maintain some parental dignity." Emma laughed, a real laugh this time, the sound surprising her with its authenticity. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling inadequate for what he'd given her, but they were all she had. "For everything. For being kind when you didn't have to be. For seeing something in me when I'd stopped seeing it myself." Alexander reached out and squeezed her shoulder briefly, a gesture of solidarity, of recognition, of one fighter acknowledging another. "We're all just trying to survive and do better, remember? Some of us just have more expensive suits while we do it." Then he was gone, striding toward his waiting team, immediately swallowed back into his world of private cars and urgent decisions and power that moved mountains. Emma stood there for a long moment, holding his card like a talisman, feeling the weight of possibilities settling over her shoulders like a cloak. She thought about Lily waiting at home, probably already in her pajamas, probably begging Mrs. Chen for just one more story before bed. She thought about the $73 in her bank account, and the rent that was due in 5 days, and the desperate mathematics of poverty that had been her constant companion. She thought about the man who just offered her a rope when she'd been drowning, not because he had to, not because of any obligation or publicity stunt, but simply because he'd seen her struggling and decided to care. The world didn't make sense sometimes. It threw you curveballs and heartbreaks and moments of grace so unexpected they felt like fiction. This morning, Emma Richardson had been invisible, Just another struggling single mother in a world that had too many to notice. Tonight, she was holding a business card that might change everything, given to her by a stranger whose shoulder she'd slept on 30,000 feet in the air. She pulled out her phone and texted Mrs. Chen, "On my way home, something incredible happened. Tell Lily Mommy has a story that's going to need extra cuddles to tell properly." Then Emma Richardson walked through JFK Airport, with her head held just a little higher, past the designer stores she couldn't afford, and the restaurants that charged $20 for a sandwich, past the business people in their expensive clothes and the families juggling strollers and luggage. She walked like a woman who'd been given a second chance, like a woman who was ready to fight for it, like a woman who'd finally remembered that she was worth fighting for. The card was still in her hand. Tomorrow at 9 a.m., she'd make the call that might change her life. But tonight, she'd go home to her daughter, hold her close and tell her a story about kindness and strangers, and the unexpected ways the universe sometimes conspires to catch you when you're falling. If you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever wondered whether anyone sees your struggle or your strength, this story is for you. If you've ever been the stranger who chose kindness when indifference would have been easier, or if you've been the one desperately needing that kindness, subscribe to this channel and become part of a community that believes in the power of human connection. Leave a comment sharing a time when a stranger's kindness changed your day, your week, or your life. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear right now. Hit that notification bell because every week we share stories that remind us why humanity is worth believing in, why giving up is never the answer, and why sometimes the most extraordinary moments happen in the most ordinary places. We're building something here, all of us together, a space where struggle is acknowledged, strength is celebrated, and hope is not just a word but a practice. Emma Richardson called at exactly 9 a.m. the next morning, her hand shaking so badly she almost dropped the phone twice before managing to dial. She'd been awake since 4:30, staring at the ceiling of her tiny bedroom, while Lily slept peacefully in the bed beside her, the card propped against the lamp on her nightstand, like a promise she was terrified to believe in. She'd spent the night oscillating between hope and terror, between imagining a future where she could buy Lily new shoes without checking her bank account first, and imagining the humiliation of showing up to Hunt Industries only to discover this had all been some elaborate joke, some rich man's momentary impulse that evaporated in the daylight. The phone rang once, twice. Emma's heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought it might crack right through. Then his voice, warm and familiar despite having heard it only once before. "Emma, I was hoping you'd call." Not his assistant, not a receptionist. Alexander Hunt himself, exactly as he'd promised, and somehow that made it real in a way it hadn't been the night before. "I almost didn't," she admitted, because lying seemed pointless when he'd already seen her at her most vulnerable. "I convinced myself 100 times last night that I'd misunderstood, that you were just being polite, that calling would be a mistake." There was a pause, and she could almost hear him thinking, choosing his words carefully. "But you called anyway. That tells me everything I need to know about your courage." He continued before she could protest that desperation wasn't the same as courage. "Can you come to the office this afternoon? 2 p.m. I'll send a car." Emma's mind raced through her schedule, the patchwork of survival she'd constructed. Mrs. Chen could watch Lily for a few more hours. She'd have to wear the same interview outfit from yesterday. Hope the wrinkles weren't too obvious. She'd need to look up Hunt Industries, prepare, figure out what questions to ask, so she didn't seem completely out of her depth. "I'll be there," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "And Emma, this isn't an interview where you have to prove yourself to me. It's a conversation where we figure out if we can build something meaningful together. There's a difference." He hung up before she could respond, leaving her standing in her cramped kitchen with her daughter's cereal bowl in one hand and a phone in the other, wondering how her life had become unrecognizable in less than 24 hours. Hunt Industries' headquarters rose into the Manhattan sky like a monument to ambition, all glass and steel and architectural audacity. Emma stood on the sidewalk staring up at it, feeling impossibly small, impossibly out of place, impossibly terrified. The car Alexander had sent, an actual town car with a driver who'd called her Ms. Richardson, like she was someone important, had dropped her at the main entrance, where people in expensive suits moved with purposeful strides, everyone looking like they knew exactly where they belonged. Emma smoothed down her jacket for the 100th time, took a breath that felt like swallowing shards of glass, and walked through doors that whispered open at her approach. The lobby was cathedral-like in its grandeur, marble floors polished to mirror brightness, a reception desk that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of marstone. The woman behind it looked up with a professional smile that flickered with surprise when Emma approached. "I'm here to see Mr. Hunt," Emma said, hating how uncertain her voice sounded, how the words felt like a question rather than a statement. The receptionist's eyebrows rose fractionally, doubt crossing her carefully made-up face. "Do you have an appointment?" The tone suggested she already knew the answer, that walk-ins claiming to have meetings with Alexander Hunt were a daily occurrence from people who didn't understand how the world actually worked. Before Emma could respond, before she could show the card she'd been clutching like a lifeline, a voice cut across the lobby. "She's with me." Alexander emerged from a private elevator Emma hadn't even noticed, dressed in another impeccable suit, moving with that same controlled power that seemed to part the air around him. The receptionist's demeanor transformed instantly, doubt replaced by professional deference. "Of course, Mr. Hunt, I apologize for any confusion." But Alexander wasn't looking at her. He was looking at Emma, and his expression was warm, welcoming, like seeing her was the best part of his day. "For you came," he said, and there was something in his voice, relief maybe, or satisfaction, that made Emma realize he'd genuinely wondered if she would. "You thought I wouldn't?" she asked, as he guided her toward the elevator. "I thought you might have decided overnight that I was crazy, that this was too good to be true, that someone like you doesn't get breaks like this." He pressed the button for the top floor. "Was I wrong?" Emma met his eyes, saw the challenge there, the invitation to be honest. "No," she admitted. "I thought all of those things. But then I thought about Lily, about the woman I want her to see when she looks at me. Someone who's brave enough to take chances even when she's scared. Someone who doesn't let fear make her decisions." The elevator rose smoothly, carrying them above the city, above the noise and chaos and grinding struggle of street level. Emma could see Manhattan spreading out below, millions of lives unfolding in those buildings, millions of stories of survival and hope and heartbreak. Somewhere down there was her apartment, her life, her reality. Up here was something else entirely. "I've been thinking about what you said," Alexander began as the elevator climbed, "about not knowing if you're qualified. So I want to tell you a story." He leaned against the elevator wall, and for a moment he looked younger, more vulnerable, like the polished exterior had cracked to reveal someone real underneath. 23 years ago, I was 17 years old, standing in an office not unlike this one, wearing my only dress shirt and shoes I'd borrowed from a friend because mine had holes in the soles. I was there to pitch an idea to an investor, a man who had no reason to listen to a kid from the wrong side of Chicago with nothing but audacity and a dream. Do you know what he said to me? Emma shook her head. He said, "I don't invest in ideas, I invest in people. And you, kid, you've got something that can't be taught. You've got hunger and heart, and the kind of desperation that builds empires because you've got no choice but to succeed." Alexander's eyes held hers. "That man gave me $50,000 and a chance. It's the only reason Hunt Industries exists. It's the only reason I'm standing here, instead of still trying to claw my way out of poverty. And I swore to myself that if I ever made it, if I ever had the power to do for someone else what he did for me, I wouldn't hesitate." The elevator doors opened onto the top floor, revealing an office space that was somehow both impossibly luxurious and surprisingly warm. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered views that seemed to stretch forever. Artwork that belonged in museums hung on walls. But there were also plants everywhere. Books scattered on surfaces, photographs that looked personal rather than decorative. This wasn't just an office. It was a space where someone actually lived part of their life. Alexander led her to a seating area by the windows, gestured for her to sit. "The position I'm offering is real, Emma. It's heading up a new initiative that I've been planning for 2 years, but couldn't find the right person to run. We're creating a program for single parents, focusing on education access, childcare support, job training, the infrastructure that makes it possible to break the cycle of poverty. Not charity, opportunity, dignity, a hand up, not a handout. He pulled out a folder, slid it across the table. This is the proposal. This is what we're building. And I need someone who understands it not as theory, but as lived experience. Someone who knows what it's like to choose between eating and paying rent. Someone who knows the exhaustion, the fear, the desperate hope that maybe tomorrow will be different. Someone like you. Emma opened the folder with trembling hands, started reading and felt tears blur her vision. It was everything. Everything she'd needed and never had. Everything she'd dreamed of for other mothers like her. Affordable childcare partnered with job training. Educational grants that covered not just tuition, but living expenses. Mentorship programs, support networks, the recognition that you can't pull yourself up by your bootstraps when you can't afford boots. "This is beautiful," she whispered. "This is going to change lives." "That's the idea," Alexander said quietly. "But Emma, I need you to understand something. This isn't a favor. This isn't me being a savior. I'm offering you this position because I genuinely believe you're the right person to run it. But it's going to be hard work, long hours, resistance from people who don't understand why a company should care about social impact, pressure and stress and moments where you'll want to quit. So before you say yes, before you take this leap, I need you to be sure, not hopeful, sure." Emma looked up from the proposal, looked at this man who'd shown her more kindness in 24 hours than most people showed in a lifetime, looked at the city spread out below them, full of people struggling just like she'd been struggling. She thought about Lily, about being able to give her a stable home, new shoes, a mother who came home from work fulfilled instead of defeated. She thought about other mothers, other families, other children who deserved better than what the world had given them. She thought about the woman who'd gotten on that plane yesterday, invisible and exhausted and ready to give up. And she thought about the woman she could become, the woman who chose courage over comfort, possibility over safety. "I'm sure," Emma said, and her voice didn't shake. "I'm terrified and completely out of my depth and probably going to make 1,000 mistakes, but I'm sure. Because this matters. Because people like me. People like your mother. People like everyone struggling out there. We deserve someone fighting for us. And if you're giving me the chance to be that person, then yes. Absolutely yes." Alexander smiled, that genuine transformation that made him look less like a CEO and more like someone who still remembered what hope felt like. "Then welcome to Hunt Industries, Emma Richardson. Let's change some lives." He extended his hand, and when Emma shook it, she felt the weight of possibility settling over her shoulders like wings. This was the beginning of something, the first page of a new chapter. The moment when falling asleep on a stranger's shoulder stopped being an embarrassing mistake and became the collision that changed everything. Because here's the truth about life that nobody tells you when you're drowning. Sometimes rescue comes from the most unexpected places. Sometimes kindness appears wearing an expensive suit on a half-empty plane. Sometimes the universe conspires to catch you exactly when you're falling, and the only question is whether you're brave enough to let it. Emma Richardson had been invisible for so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen. But Alexander Hunt had seen her, really seen her, and in that seeing had offered her not just a job, but a purpose, not just a salary, but dignity, not just an opportunity, but a chance to pay forward the kindness that had saved her. This was how the world changed, she realized. Not through grand gestures or headlines, but through moments like this. One person choosing to care. One person choosing to help. One person choosing to believe in another when they'd stopped believing in themselves. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start a revolution of hope. This was their story, Emma and Alexander, the single mother and the billionaire CEO, but it's also your story and mine, and everyone who's ever felt invisible or impossible or like giving up was the only option left. It's the story of what happens when we choose connection over indifference, when we see the humanity in strangers, when we remember that we're all just trying to survive and do better with what we've been given. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that miracles still happen in ordinary moments, then don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe to this channel and join a community that believes in the power of human kindness. Share this video with someone who needs to remember that they're seen, that they matter, that their struggle isn't invisible. Leave a comment telling us about a time when unexpected kindness changed your path. Or tell us how you've been the person who offered that kindness to someone else. We're all in this together, building a world where compassion isn't rare but common, where helping isn't heroic but human. Thank you for being here. Thank you for believing that stories like this matter. And thank you for being the kind of person who chooses hope even when the world makes it hard. We'll see you in the next story. But until then, remember, you are seen, you are valued, and you are never as alone as you think you are.